Okay, so now let's discuss some of the things that guide the why, the where, the what, the how of our stress application. And we have discussed this already, but the first thing that we have to understand when using this kind of approach, it's actually incredibly important to understand this, is that movement from an observable standpoint is just the expression of coordinated muscular and joint actions that occur across a defined range of motion or movement excursion. Okay, that's what movement is. Okay, that's what we can see. Where we get where things get confusing and very complicated is when people try to judge movement as good or bad. When they say that they know what movement is functional and what movement is faulty or dysfunctional, that's problematic because they will typically say that movement that is painful is dysfunctional and faulty. But we just covered why that is a silly thing to say. Okay? So if we understand that that's what movement is, and as movement practitioners, we use movement, we use exercise to manipulate physical stress, mechanical stress, we need to understand that a large part of what we do, one of the primary tools that we have is to manipulate physical stress, mainly via movement, but mainly via muscle contractions, muscular contractions. If you know of any neurological disease where someone loses the ability to contract their muscles, you will understand how difficult movement is for those individuals. So this is a really important source of stress in the body. A muscle contraction is a source of internal force. When we move, yes, we deal with external forces, external stressors that try to put movement into our body, but we generate internal forces via muscular contractions to counteract those external forces. And that interaction between the external force and the internal force is what creates that force. Force is an interaction, and we experience that force then. That force has to be managed by things, has to be managed by muscles, joints, ligaments, tendons, joint surfaces, lots of structures in the body. But muscular contractions, again, another way of just broadly describing things. I really wanted to use this module here to give us really broad descriptions, because then we can just be more thoughtful with what we're doing instead of trying to kind of see what little buckets things fall into. The more broad we can start, the better we can move on from there. But we use the manipulation of physical stress to influence certain variables, okay? And because we understand that movement is the expression of coordinated muscular joint actions that occur across a range of motion and movement excursion, those are the two things that we can directly influence in an honest way. That's why we went through some of those previous slides. So we manipulate physical stress to influence range of motion, to develop more appropriate muscular force production capabilities, which happens via a muscular contraction. So we contract muscles through a range of motion. That's what movement is. Okay? The brain doesn't talk down, it doesn't send a motor signal to your joints, to your tendons, to your fascia. I'm sorry to say that for the fascia lovers out there. It sends a motor signal to the muscle. That's it from a movement standpoint. So that's what we need to be more interested in, is a muscle contraction. Again, it's so simple, but when you can understand this, and when we get into the assessment and exercise rehab strategies, it really completely changes how you think your way through things, how you organize movement. And I think because it's a fundamental principle of movement, it's going to last forever. It's going to be how you will look at movement forever. So those are the two things that we're trying to influence: range of motion and force production. But again, this will get very detailed when we link it back to the client. Does the client have pain during a range of motion? Do they have, an actual joint restriction or muscular restriction? Is a certain area a certain joint, for example, when we move it through a range of motion, is it painful because it is experiencing far too much stress and load because other areas are not contributing to the management of forces, and so as a result, the area in pain is experiencing a lot of muscle guarding and stiffness, for example. And in order to influence that range of motion of that local area, we need to get other areas doing more work so we can reduce the need for that co-contraction, muscular guarding. Okay, so you can see how detailed you can get into this when you link it back to the individual's unique limitations and their unique story. And then, of course, like we mentioned before, we use our words to educate, to reassure, to change behavior, to manage expectations. These are all things that are really important as well. But generally, we educate, reassure, change behavior to try and have an influence on how the individual is moving in the real world. You know, we can cue them, we can coach them through certain things. You know, because it really all comes back to muscular and joint behavior. But like I said previously, we understand that there's lots of other things that go on in the background, and sometimes we like to get, you know, very smart about things. But if we're really being honest, all we can directly observe and assess and measure and change during rehab is muscle and joint behavior. You might do something and you might say, I'm changing the fascia here, but you're actually trying to change the fascia via muscular and joint manipulation. And then you're reassessing through muscular and joint behavior. You're always changing the muscles and joints and reassessing the muscles and joints. But what people do when they try to be too smart is they infer that something else has led to that change. That, oh, the muscle is changing length now because I changed the fascia, or the joint is moving better now because, you know, I got the organs mobilizing better. You know, it's changing because I, you know, changed how airflow is moving through the body. I changed how fluid is moving in the joint, for example. You're inferring, you're assuming lots of things. But the key thing there is that you cannot say that honestly. You cannot honestly say that. All you can say honestly is that the muscle and joint changed. So why not just focus on the muscle and joint first? That's all we're saying. That's all we're saying. We're trying to keep it as simple as possible here. And of course, we use these tools to modify symptoms and pain. Again, there's lots of things in addition to movement that we can, you know, use to apply stress to the body. And so in addition to this information here, we can go deeper into, you know, what is stress, what is force. You know, there's different forces that can act on the body. There's tensile forces, you know, a pulling force. When a muscle pulls on a bone, it creates a tensile force. It can create a compressive force. It can pull joint surfaces together. It can create torsional force, torsional stress, shear stress. There's lots of ways we can stress things. If you lie on a foam roller, you're stressing the body. You're putting pressure on the body. But what's different about lying on a foam roller? What's different about, you know, applying manual pressure to the body? You're not asking the body to respond to that stress with a muscular contraction, some kind of internal force. Okay, you're applying external force, passive force to the system, which can certainly be helpful. It can change tolerance. If you've got a lot of muscular guarding in an area, you can get some pressure through it. You know, we don't have to make our explanations too sexy. You know, you put your hands on the body, you put pressure. You're putting pressure on the body. That's what you're doing. Don't make it sound sexier than it actually is. You're putting pressure in the body. You might be moving the muscles. You're changing the length of the muscles. You're changing the angles of the joints. Those are things that we can change on a muscular and joint behavior. But don't get too sexy too soon with your explanations. Keep it simple. So yes, we can use these tools. Again, one tool is physical stress manipulation to change symptoms and pain. But first we have to understand, okay, well, what movements, what positions are associated with pain that they cannot tolerate. We need that to make a decision on what we need to do. You know, what specific muscular and joint actions and positions are painful? Do you have a client that only has pain during movements, or do you have a client that has pain when they sit down and when they're at rest? Or maybe they feel better at rest, but that transition from rest to movement, they feel really stiff, it's very painful, and then with more movement, they feel better. These are all different behaviors that we can use to guide our understanding as well. How much force and load can they tolerate? So it's not just about load going to the system, but what is the load profile, force profile? Are you saying, ouch, that's painful when I put a little bit of stress and force in the body? Or are you saying, ouch, that's painful when I put a lot of stress in the body? Okay, those are different things. Are their aggravating tasks the same as their goal tasks? For example, you have a runner that develops knee pain, been running for a long time, all of a sudden maybe spikes their volume in a week, bang, they have some anterior knee pain. And now all of a sudden, they have pain when they're walking, going up and down stairs, getting out of bed in the morning. So their goal task is to get back running. Yes, a goal is to be able to get out of bed and walk, do stairs without pain, but the ultimate goal, their meaningful goal, is to get back to running. But you have to influence aggravating tasks now, like walking, going up and down stairs, getting out of bed in the morning, and goal tasks. So what we need to ultimately do is deconstruct these aggravating tasks, goal tasks. We can deconstruct the muscular and joint behavior of these goal tasks and aggravating tasks. And we can use those aggravating tasks and goal tasks to guide a large portion of the objective assessment as well. So we're looking at, okay, don't just look at the task. This is something that we'll really stress when we get to the assessment is, don't just assess multi-joint tasks. Like going up and down the stairs is a multi-joint task. You need ankle plantar flexors, knee extensors. There's other joints, tissues that need to be able to handle load. But, in a multi-joint task, multiple muscles and multiple joints are contributing to your ability to perform that task. But we need to deconstruct that and say, okay, how is the ankle functioning? How are the muscles and joints behaving around the ankle? How are the muscles and joints behaving around the knee? You have to deconstruct things into local things in order to get a clearer, more honest understanding of how they are tolerating that stress.